What would you do if you were asked to leave your first-class seat, the one you booked with your name clearly printed on the ticket, just because, according to a flight attendant, you didn't look like someone who belonged there? No yelling, no struggle, no one pulled out their phone to defend you, just a glance from the crew, a request soft as a breeze, yet sharp enough to scratch at your dignity. And the worst part? No one stood up, no one apologized, no one even realized a mistake had been made, until a call was made. A call that lasted exactly 43 seconds. And 43 seconds later, the entire flight came to a halt. The crew was replaced, and the American airline industry began rewriting the way it treats its passengers, all because one woman in a red dress refused to stand up from her seat. This story isn't about a seat. It's about the right to remain seated. It's about a silence louder than a scream. And it started at gate C-17 with one ticket, one glance, and a decision that changed everything. Sierra Monroe had never been one for showmanship. Even as the founder of Orion Air, one of the fastest-growing airlines in North America, she kept her old habits, working quietly, taking handwritten notes, and spending more time observing than commanding. With her neatly tied black curly hair in a high ponytail, a simple red tracksuit, and worn-out white sneakers, Sierra looked no different than a regular passenger trying to catch the evening flight to Seattle. The only thing that set her apart at that moment was the mission she carried. Protocol Mercury, a covert internal inspection known only to 3 members of the executive board, launched after a wave of discrimination complaints involving the staff at Dallas Love Field, one of Orion Air's busiest hubs. Her backpack carried nothing but a slim laptop, a dark brown leather notebook embossed with the CEO's seal, and a printed file labeled Hub DLF, Suspect Activity Records. From the moment she founded Orion Air, Sierra had set out to build an airline that stood for innovation and equity. 5 years ago, at a press conference, she had declared, "I don't just want to take people from point A to point B. I want to make sure that whether you wear a suit or a hoodie, whether you sit in first class or economy, you're treated like a human being worthy of respect." But that declaration was being tested. A young employee in HR had once sent her an anonymous email. "Something's rotting in Dallas. They're stopping people because of clothes, names, accents. They tear down trust, yet get bonuses for on-time departures." That sentence had kept her up for 3 nights straight, and that's why she was here today. Not in her 34th floor climate-controlled office in Seattle, but amid the crowd at gate C-17, surrounded by the soft screeching of rolling suitcases, the smell of stale coffee, and the rhythmic drone of the public address system. Orion Flight 1735 was scheduled to depart at 5:20 p.m., a direct route to SeaTac International Airport. Sierra's ticket was a first-class one, an internal privilege she reserved for investigative trips. But today, she wasn't boarding to enjoy comfort. She was here to see how her system would respond when the highest-ranking executive showed up not as a VIP with a lanyard badge, but as an ordinary black woman in a red tracksuit traveling alone. She had prepared thoroughly. No assistant, no advance notice to any branch. She bought her ticket under the name S. Monette, a reversed version of her own surname. She used her actual passport, original, reissued the previous year, with no anomalies. She left behind her expensive watch, removed her earrings, and chose a plain hairstyle to avoid attention. These details might seem trivial to others, but for Sierra, they were a test. She wanted to know how much of the kindness in her system was genuine, and how much was just polish over performance metrics. The area around gate C-17 was crowded but not chaotic. Electronic boards blinked flight information. A family of 3 was fumbling for their tickets. A group of young men in suits scrolled through their phones. A middle-aged man scowled at the boarding delay, and behind the counter stood a stiff-bodied blonde woman working on the terminal, Cheryl Madden, the lead gate agent in this area. She had sharp eyes, a curt voice, and a gaze that always began with suspicion. Sierra had already reviewed Cheryl's personnel file. She was among the most frequently complained about employees, mostly for her attitude toward passengers deemed insufficiently polite or untrustworthy in appearance. But with her seniority and perfect attendance hours, Cheryl was always rated technically reliable. And like many systems blinded by metrics, Orion Air had once overlooked the letters, the feedback, the lines saying, I think I was denied because I'm Indian, African American, Muslim. Sierra had read every single one, but there was never enough evidence, never enough voices. She stepped into the early boarding line, keeping her face neutral. Cheryl was smiling at a white couple ahead. "Enjoy your honeymoon, darlings." But her expression shifted the moment her eyes met Sierra's. The smile vanished almost instantly. No greeting, no friendly glance. Just a quick, sharp, cold once-over. Sierra held out her phone, boarding pass displayed on screen. She said calmly, "Flight 1735, first class." Cheryl frowned. "First class? In that outfit?" Her tone sliced like a knife. Sierra didn't react. She simply extended her passport, the familiar deep blue cover with United States of America embossed beneath the fluorescent light. Cheryl took it with two fingers as if it were a crumpled receipt. She didn't scan it, didn't run it under the UV scanner, just held it, flipped it back and forth, and examined it under the light. "This photo doesn't really look like you. The real face is more gloomy." A short chuckle rose from Cheryl's throat. Sierra stayed silent. She knew the passport was valid. Photo taken 2 years ago. Professional and tidy. She kept her expression blank, as though she'd heard nothing. Cheryl scoffed, turned another page, then lowered her voice, though intentionally loud enough for those behind to hear. "You know what I've seen? Fake documents, fake credit cards, even fake people." The words landed like a punch. Sierra tightened her grip on her backpack strap, not out of fear, but to restrain her instinct to respond. This was no longer a test. This was live evidence. Cheryl still wasn't done, eyes narrowing. "You think just because you've got a U.S. passport, you can get on any flight you want? Looking like this? Smelling like cheap cologne?" A few passengers began turning their heads. A young woman pulled out her phone, pointing the camera toward the counter. Cheryl noticed, but instead of stopping, she did something no one expected. In a moment of pure provocation, Cheryl held up the passport, looked Sierra dead in the eye, and said slowly, "Let me help you settle this. Right here." Then she tore the passport in half. The sound of tearing paper rang out sharply in the sudden silence. The two pieces of the passport drifted from Cheryl's hand and landed gently on the silver-gray plastic counter. All surrounding sounds seemed to vanish. No more suitcase wheels, no more intercom, just wide-eyed stares from witnesses and the unmoving face of Sierra Monroe. She didn't scream, didn't slam the counter, didn't cry. She simply stood tall, eyes fixed on the torn pages bearing the American eagle, now split in two by an act of administrative violence so absurd it was almost laughable. Then from her backpack, she pulled out her phone, already unlocked, pressed one button. "Activate Protocol Mercury, Gate C-17, incident confirmed. Freeze operations. Legal to standby." Her voice was steady, then she hung up. No one in the boarding line knew what had just begun, but to Sierra the battlefield had just been drawn. Cheryl Madden was not the kind of person who backed down in any situation. With nearly 20 years working the gates for various airlines large and small, she believed she'd seen it all. Drunk passengers, people trying to sneak into first class with fake passes, mothers hiding pets in handbags, and 1,000 other forms of deception. To Cheryl, the gate wasn't just a place to check tickets. It was her domain, a space where she held the power to decide who boarded and who didn't. She saw herself as the final guardian of aviation security, and with that belief, she had built an unwritten standard of her own, a kind of intuition blending bias and micro-authority, which she always justified as professional instinct. That afternoon, Cheryl stood behind counter C-17, lips tightly pressed, a habit when tense, eyes scanning the Orion Flight 1735 schedule on screen. Everything was unfolding like any other day, until the woman in red stepped into the priority lane. She carried no large luggage, bore no gold member tags, no fancy credit cards, no trace of expensive perfume like most first-class passengers Cheryl was used to. Just a simple backpack and a face. Too calm, too quiet. Cheryl didn't like quiet. It usually came with something hidden. After tearing Sierra's passport in half, the woman she still believed was a suspicious traveler, Cheryl felt a strange, satisfying surge through her body. That act wasn't just about solving a document issue. It was a declaration of control. In Cheryl's world, a world where every plane ticket carried an untold story, she had decided that the woman in red didn't deserve a first-class seat, and with a simple flick of the wrist, she had carried out her own version of justice. But then, there was no reaction as expected. No argument, no threats, no woman screaming, crying, demanding a manager, like so many other cases Cheryl had handled. Instead, she stood still, pulled out her phone, made a call that lasted mere seconds, and hung up. No raised voice, no step backward, no sign of fear. Cheryl began to feel tightness in her chest, the same discomfort she'd felt 4 years ago during a surprise visit from internal audit. Passengers behind her started murmuring. A few whispered questions about what was going on. Cheryl folded her arms, trying to maintain composure. A young passenger who had been filming from the start continued recording. Cheryl snapped, "Turn that off. No filming allowed here." But the girl only tilted her head slightly, saying nothing. An elderly couple looked at Cheryl with confusion, then turned to Sierra, who still stood tall, her eyes sharp as steel. Cheryl stepped back, reaching for her radio to call a supervisor, when she saw two people in black suits walking up the terminal, a man and a woman, with no name tags, no introductions, just a quick flash of federal badges. "Agent Lane, TSA. We were dispatched to address a case of federal document destruction," the man said, voice deep and measured. Cheryl froze. "Destruction? I just—" Her words caught in her throat as the woman in red pulled out an internal ID badge. Not the kind issued to ground staff, but a high-clearance executive badge. The kind of which only 4 existed in all of Orion Air. Printed clearly on it, Sierra Monroe, founder and chief executive officer, Orion Airlines. Cheryl's mind went blank. Words failed her. The name Sierra Monroe wasn't unfamiliar. It was the name on every company-wide email, every internal broadcast, every vision handbook. She had always pictured the CEO as a white man with silver hair and a suit. A mental image shaped entirely by assumption. Yet the person standing before her now, with worn-out white sneakers, a hooded top, and a cold stare, was the very one who held absolute authority over the company. She had torn the CEO's passport. Airport police began to approach, along with 3 security personnel from operations control. One raised his radio and ordered Gate C-17 shut down immediately. Scene secured. No entry or exit allowed. Cheryl began to tremble. Her fingers stiffened, throat parched. Frank Davis, the zone manager, rushed in like he'd been jolted awake. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, then froze at the scene. Sierra turned to him, her voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "I'm the head of Orion Air. Your staff member has just destroyed a federal document, violated passenger security, and demonstrated clear discriminatory behavior." Frank tried to smile awkwardly. "There must be some misunderstanding, Ms. Monroe. I'm sure Cheryl was just following protocol." Sierra cut him off. "Protocol does not include tearing up a passport. I wrote the protocol." By now the crowd had been held back behind security tape, but their eyes remained fixed on Sierra and Cheryl. A man in a suit murmured to his companion, "Holy hell. That's the CEO?" The other nodded, eyes glued to the phone screen, replaying the moment Cheryl tore the document. The video had already started circulating. Cheryl now stood as though on a sheet of thin ice. Any movement could plunge her beneath. She looked to Frank for support, but the man who had once shielded her now avoided her gaze. He whispered something to a security officer, then backed away from the inner circle. Cheryl was left alone, facing the CEO, federal agents, and police. Sierra looked her straight in the eye and spoke for the first time with a voice like a blade. "You didn't know who I was. That's not the problem. The problem is, you thought you had the right to decide who deserves respect based solely on appearance." Cheryl stammered. I felt something was off. That passport looked odd. I had a hunch." Sierra didn't blink. "A hunch? Based on skin color, hairstyle, or a tracksuit?" The question landed like a gunshot. Cheryl couldn't answer. Somewhere, a camera shutter clicked. Every passing second felt like a nail driven into a career she once thought unshakable. Over the next 45 minutes, Gate C-17 became a federal investigation scene. Orion Flight 1735 was grounded on the tarmac. The passenger list was reviewed. Security footage was requested on the spot. Cheryl was isolated, questioned on site, then escorted away from the gate. Not in handcuffs, but no one doubted what awaited her behind the metal doors of the airport's investigation room. Frank Davis was summoned to his office. He knew what was coming. Sierra didn't need to yell. She only needed to show up, and every mask fell away. The sound of the passport being torn in two still echoed in Sierra's mind, even though nearly an hour had passed since the incident. It wasn't like any sound she had heard during her time running Orion Air. Not the alert of an air traffic control system, not the delay announcements from the tower, nor the familiar grumbles of impatient passengers. It was the sound of recklessness, fueled by entitlement. A short rip, yet it opened a whole new abyss where professionalism was just a surface, and beneath it lay layers upon layers of prejudice that had festered too long without ever being named properly. Cheryl had been escorted away. Not a word of resistance, not a single plea. Her face was pale as paper, eyes vacant, steps unsteady like someone pulled out of a dream. But Sierra felt no satisfaction. She didn't do this for revenge. She did it because she had to, because she was forced to look directly at what senior meetings had always tried to avoid. That discrimination didn't come from the media, or from competitors, or even customers, but from the very people Orion Air had once entrusted with power. And on that day, that power was abused right in front of her, so blatantly that the act itself became undeniable evidence. The federal response team had sealed off Gate C-17. Airport police set up a soft perimeter, asking passengers to move back and make space for the investigation. 2 FBI agents in dark suits, holding tablets and nylon gloves, were documenting the scene. One of them picked up the 2 torn halves of the passport from the floor using specialized tweezers and carefully placed them into a sealed evidence bag. That slow, repetitive action, with mechanical precision, was like a ritual initiating a case they knew would go far beyond a loss of composure at work. Frank Davis, the zone manager, just called back to his office for questioning, returned now with a face torn between confusion, fear, and a strained attempt at professionalism. He approached Sierra, cautiously keeping a distance of exactly 3 steps, as if to avoid her gaze. "Ms. Monroe, I apologize for the incident. Cheryl, she clearly lost control, but I assure you, we'll cooperate fully with the investigation." Sierra didn't reply immediately. She stood still, eyes on the electronic board displaying flight info. Orion Flight 1735, delayed. The orange text blinked like a silent signal. Then she turned to Frank, her voice still low but no longer soft. "You say lost control as if this were an accident, but I witnessed a procedure being completely broken. No one loses control when they deliberately tear up a federal document in front of a camera, with at least 10 witnesses. This wasn't a slip-up. It was intentional. And I need to know why someone like that is still in that position after all these years." Frank faltered, lips tightening. "Wihana did have a few complaints, but nothing serious. Nothing with solid evidence. I always encouraged Cheryl to be more diplomatic, but she always met her targets. Every flight boarded on time. No technical violations." Sierra nodded slightly, her eyes reflecting something hard to define. Not rage, but a resolve that had fully matured. "Sometimes the most important things aren't in the metrics. They're in what you choose not to document." Frank went quiet. He knew she was right, and he knew he had been wrong from the beginning, since the first time he ignored a complaint from a Pakistani passenger just because the man's English was unclear. Since the time he told Cheryl to watch her tone instead of logging the incident. Since learning how to survive in the system by choosing rationalization over action. Sierra turned to the agents. "I want to file the incident report directly with TSA and FAA representatives. I have the authority to execute an internal emergency inspection. Protocol Mercury has been activated. We will temporarily suspend the operational authority of the Dallas coordination team until a preliminary investigation is complete." One of the 2 agents nodded and handed her a phone. On the line was the FAA's Director of Emergency Liaison, who had been informed by her earlier call. We confirm Ms. Monroe's executive-level authority. All of her temporary directives will carry legal weight for a period of 3 days from the time of declaration. We will coordinate fully. The official investigation began at that moment. No press release, no press conference, no primetime coverage. Just simple questions, sharp as knives. Who scheduled Cheryl during this shift? Who handled the customer complaint about her last month? Why has the passport scanner not been updated in 11 months? How many denied boardings at Gate C-17 in the past 6 months involve passengers of color or with foreign names? Sierra didn't attend every step. She stood at the center, watching the camera grid on a large screen. Her hand still held the same notebook. What Cheryl tore today wasn't just a passport, it was the symbol of a dividing line. A line between appearance and true value. A line between service and control. A line between what Orion Air claimed to be and what it had actually become. She wrote a line in the notebook. When the person denied boarding is the very one running the system, then the issue is no longer an incident. It's structural. Beneath it, she added a bullet point. Compile personnel list at Dallas Hub based on actual influence, not job title. Track who controls whom. This was no longer an investigation into one employee. It was a full-scale restructuring campaign. Outside, passengers were slowly being redirected to another gate. A soft, routine system announcement echoed through the concourse. Flight 1735 has been reassigned to Gate C-21. We apologize for the delay. No one knew that behind that simple gate reassignment lay a battle for power already underway, and that the woman in red was the epicenter of a tremor now spreading from one boarding gate through the entire structure of Orion Air. Sierra exhaled slowly and leaned against the wall. For the first time in years, she understood clearly why she couldn't just be a CEO. She had to be the gatekeeper too. When the first members of Orion Air's senior coordination team in Seattle received the call marked Protocol Mercury, Code Red Level at 5:14 p.m., they didn't need to ask for clarification. Inside the company, Mercury was the highest level alert signal used only when the CEO herself encountered an incident related to identity, authority, or personal security during a field investigation. And the words red level confirmed that the issue was no longer personal. It had the potential to escalate into a systemic crisis. More importantly, the call had come from a number every regional executive recognized, the direct phone number of Sierra Monroe. On the other end, Sierra's voice wasn't raised, nor did it sound urgent. It carried only one thing: command. I'm at Gate C-17, Dallas Hub. Activate Mercury. Emergency classification. Type 1. Suspend all operations involving DLF regional personnel. Require TSA and FBI presence on site within 20 minutes. All camera footage at Gate C-17, passport scan data logs, internal complaint history, and HR records from the past 5 years. Everything must be collected, backed up, and sealed within 2 hours. No explanations, no meetings, no PR. Execute immediately. The only response from the other end: confirmed. The call ended so quickly that onlookers had no idea what had just taken place. They only saw Sierra standing tall, phone in hand, her eyes unshaken, and all movements around her space beginning to shift. Airport operations normally ran on a predictable rhythm: boarding on time, passengers in line, smiling staff, steady intercom announcements. But within 10 minutes of that call, the atmosphere around Gate C-17 began to change in ways no one had anticipated. Men and women in dark suits appeared at both ends of the terminal, carrying specialized cases, communication earpieces, and federal badges. A team of 3 from Orion's Internal Aviation Security Assurance Division arrived via emergency elevator, accompanied by IT engineers in plain clothes. Field data collection devices were deployed immediately: portable hard drives, floor-level data scanners, internal software not available on any commercial network. Another team began auditing the JetBridge system logs, cross-referencing Cheryl's badge-in time, each action she performed at the gate terminal, and the exact moment she tore the passport. Every second was accounted for. Frank Davis stood at the center of that storm, trying to appear composed, but internally, a single question repeated on a loop: how did this spiral out of control so fast? He knew Sierra was decisive. He had seen her resolve a pilot strike within 24 hours by flying to the airport and speaking privately with each crew member in the break room. He had heard the story of how she personally caught a senior manager falsifying timesheets, and within 48 hours, the entire department had been replaced. No press needed. But this was different. There was something in her eyes, the way she looked at him at the gate, the way her voice didn't need to be loud to weigh like stone, that told him something invisible had been crossed. This wasn't about an employee tearing up a document. This was the consequence of cover-ups, of behaviors that had been ignored, of years spent handling internally just to avoid media hassles. Inside a temporary emergency office on the third floor of the DLF wing, Sierra was in a closed meeting with the internal security team and two agents from the Department of Transportation. On the large screen was footage pulled from the ceiling camera at Gate C-17, clearly showing Cheryl's every movement, the contemptuous glance, the mocking gestures, the moment she held the passport with two fingers, and finally, the deliberate act of raising the document and tearing it in half with a look of smug satisfaction. There were no signs of panic, no hesitation, no glances toward management for approval, no effort to scan or verify the passport through official systems. It was an act carried out with full awareness and a sense of absolute power. Sierra nodded, signaling to cut the video. She spoke briefly. "We have confirmed deliberate destruction of a federal document, passenger misconduct, violation of operational standards and verification procedures. She is a threat not only to passengers, but to the entire standard we've built." A technical director sitting beside her added, "We've pulled 17 complaints about Cheryl in the past 24 months. 11 of them involved discriminatory behavior toward Black, Asian, or Muslim passengers. 9 of those were never escalated to senior management." Sierra was unsurprised. She turned to Frank, seated across from her, no longer protesting, just silently dabbing sweat with a tissue. She said plainly, without euphemism, "You knew, and you chose to do nothing." Frank couldn't deny it. He lowered his head and remained silent. Inside, he felt a combination of shame, anger, and regret. But it was all too late. The decisions he once thought of as trouble avoidance were now undeniable evidence of systemic complicity. And for the first time in years, he could feel the legs of his chair being pulled out from under him, one by one. Outside the meeting room, the forensic work continued. Cameras were reviewed to analyze boarding patterns for other flights through Gate C-17, cross-checked against passenger denials. AI voice analysis software was introduced to scan Cheryl's tone of voice toward passengers through the intercom system. Preliminary results showed a 400% increase in rudeness toward passengers whose names were not standard English. From what initially seemed like small clues, a behavioral pattern began to emerge, and it wasn't an individual act. It was a system, formed and sustained by compromise. As night fell over Dallas Love Field Airport, operations at Gate C-17 remained frozen. Orion Flight 1735 had been reassigned to Gate C-21, now with a new crew. And Cheryl Madden? She was being held for questioning. The charges went beyond unprofessional conduct. Upon verification, she would be prosecuted for destruction of a federal document, a serious crime with potential prison time. And whether she realized it or not, her actions had officially triggered one of the most sweeping discrimination investigations in the airline industry since 2001. Sierra stepped out of the meeting room, shoulders relaxing. Her eyes met those of a young janitorial worker pushing a trash cart down the hall. The girl paused briefly and whispered, "Thank you for not staying silent." Sierra nodded, continuing toward the quiet corridor. There was no applause, no music playing, but she knew the quake had just begun. As Agent Lane walked away from the scene with a preliminary report in hand, his heavy footsteps echoed against the polished stone floors of Gate C-17's internal corridor. The chaos had settled, but no one dared call the atmosphere stable. Passengers had been relocated. The gate had been sealed. The aircraft remained on standby at the edge of the tarmac. But the only person whose breath remained steady, whose eyes never faltered, and whose voice never shifted from beginning to end, was still Sierra Monroe. The woman who had walked in wearing a red sweatshirt and worn-out white sneakers was now seated in a temporary conference room, surrounded by Orion's legal team, federal representatives, and the crisis management unit that had been urgently activated. A large screen replayed the footage of Cheryl Madden flipping through the passport, smirking, and tearing it cleanly in half with a decisive expression. The video was paused at the precise moment the tear sliced through the embossed national seal, creating a symbolic rupture, not just through the paper, but through the public's faith in what was supposed to be a civilized customer experience. Sierra turned to the federal representatives, her voice steady and firm. "You've seen enough. From this moment forward, I will take over all personnel-related actions within Orion Air. All individuals involved, including direct supervisors, shift leads, and the regional HR team, will be temporarily suspended pending the investigation. I will announce this myself." Frank Davis stood not far away. His dress shirt was long soaked in sweat. He knew full well what Sierra meant by "announce this herself." She wasn't referring to a press release. She was about to stand up, walk out, and personally inform every employee in the vicinity who she was and what was truly happening. 11 minutes later, the entire active shift was assembled in a central corridor, roughly 70 meters from Gate C-17, where service carts were usually lined along the walls. About 25 people gathered, varying in age, gender, and ethnicity, dressed in Orion uniforms or business attire. They didn't fully understand why they were summoned, but every face bore the look of cautious alertness. Standing at the center, Sierra didn't take a platform, didn't use a mic, and didn't have any spotlight. She simply stood, upright, composed, and began to speak in a voice so clear no one needed to lean in to hear. "My name is Sierra Monroe. I am the founder and CEO of Orion Air. Today, I'm not here as an executive, but as a passenger. A passenger who was denied boarding not because of a lack of credentials, but because I wore a sweatshirt, sneakers, and held a valid passport that one of your staff decided didn't look real. A staff member whose behavior I know many of you have witnessed for months, if not years, and you stayed silent." No one spoke. An older man in the back tightened the strap on his shoulder bag. A young female employee took a sharp breath. Sierra continued, "People don't rip up a passport out of impulse. They do it because they believe they can, because they believe no one will hold them accountable, because they know their supervisors will protect them, because they believe if the person being harmed looks low enough, different enough, quiet enough, nothing will happen." She paused briefly, scanning the room. "I'm here to prove them wrong, and I'm not here in anger. I'm here to begin recovery, with truth." Frank started to step forward, but Sierra raised her hand gently. "You don't need to say anything further. You'll be contacted separately for debriefing. Right now, I just need everyone here to listen." She turned back to the staff. "I'm not asking who reported her. I'm asking who saw and didn't. I'm not asking for anyone to bow their head in apology. I need people brave enough to raise their heads, starting tomorrow under a new system, to ensure this doesn't happen again." A middle-aged man in a suit, logistics manager, quietly removed his ID badge, walked up, placed it on a nearby table, and walked away. No one stopped him. A wave of silence swept through the hallway. There were no applause, no cheers, only the sense that something was crumbling and something else was beginning. Cheryl Madden, currently detained in an isolation room, remained unaware of everything unfolding outside. She still didn't fully grasp the severity of her actions. In her mind, the thought persisted. "I did the right thing." She looked like someone who forged documents. It was instinct. But what Cheryl didn't understand, and perhaps never would, was that instinct doesn't excuse responsibility. It certainly doesn't shield you from consequences when that instinct is sustained by privilege and protected by a complicit system. And today, that system had just been severed, like a frayed electrical wire, by the very person who created it. At 8:12 p.m., an internal notification was sent to the entire company's email system, internal platform, and staff app. The subject line was simple: from Sierra Monroe, CEO. The message wasn't long. "Today at Dallas Hub, Gate C-17, I was denied first-class boarding by a gate agent who believed my appearance was not consistent with that of a U.S. passport holder. She destroyed my personal document in front of witnesses. This behavior is unacceptable. I have activated Protocol Mercury. A comprehensive investigation is now underway. In the coming weeks, there will be significant changes to personnel, procedures, and enforcement oversight at all levels. I ask each of us, from janitor to regional director, to seriously examine the system we are currently operating. And I promise you this: respect will no longer be something we hope for. It will be something we require. The message was reshared by hundreds of employees within 30 minutes. Some agreed, some were frightened, some remained silent. But everyone understood. This was not a routine audit. No one knew exactly what Sierra had noticed, how much she had recorded, or who she had been watching all along. And that was exactly why it worked. No threats, no yelling, just the knowledge that she was watching. Back in the DLF emergency control room, the access system dashboard showed Cheryl's internal account had been disabled. Frank's account was flagged for indirect accountability investigation. 3 other employees were placed under review. The internal complaint log was being cross-checked against personnel files and department transfer histories. An unprecedented document audit had been launched. But for Sierra, this was just the beginning. She returned to the conference room and pulled out a single sheet of paper from her backpack. Printed in bold at the top, Operation Equal Air, Draft 0. Beneath it were bullet points: a new system for recording misconduct, no anonymity, complete retraining of all ground staff, overseen by a third-party firm, AI to detect bias in real-time boarding decisions, a mandatory code of ethics with enforceable consequences, internal disciplinary procedures that didn't rely on media exposure, sufficient to deter, sufficient to protect those in the right, and at the bottom handwritten, no position holds the right to weaponize silence. Less than an hour after Sierra Monroe revealed her identity in the central hallway of Dallas Hub, chaos officially began. But not the loud kind. No screaming or shoving. This was modern chaos. Silent, fast as electricity, noiseless, yet sweeping like a storm. It all started with a 36-second phone video recorded by a young passenger at the end of the boarding line, who managed to capture the moment Cheryl Madden tore up Sierra's passport, accompanied by a quiet voiceover. She just tore up her passport for looking too black to fly first class. There was no sound effect, no background music, no filter, just raw footage, a real voice, a real reaction. But it spread like a spark dropped into an open barrel of gasoline. The video first appeared on TikTok from the account at Flying with Shay, then was reposted to X, Reddit, and Instagram within 15 minutes. Just 40 minutes later, the hashtag number sign GateC17 rose to second on the nationwide trending list, right after a trivial entertainment update. But at minute 46, when a former Orion Air employee quoted the clip and wrote, "I used to work under Cheryl. This doesn't surprise me at all. We all knew." Everything exploded. Public attention shifted from the act of one individual to a larger question. How many other Cheryls are there in the airline industry that we don't know by name? At Dallas Hub, the internal communications department began receiving hundreds of press inquiries, from local TV channels to digital news platforms. Reporters started showing up at the airport, though none were allowed access to Gate C-17, which remained sealed under ongoing federal investigation. Airport police set up 3 additional mobile barricades to keep outsiders from approaching the corridor. Orion Air staff were ordered not to comment. All employees directly involved in the incident were instructed to remain silent and sign a temporary 48-hour non-disclosure agreement under Clause Mercury 2. Inside Gate C-17, the atmosphere was more suffocating than any delayed boarding ever experienced. Police and federal agents were still taking statements and collecting evidence. Cheryl's workstation had been sealed, and the entire terminal system was dismantled and removed. Overhead surveillance was live streaming directly to the data center in Seattle. Anyone entering the area had to scan a badge, log their arrival time down to the minute, and provide a reason and purpose for access. Meanwhile, Cheryl Madden, who had entered her shift that afternoon with a cold, smug demeanor, was now sitting in an internal isolation room with no phone, no Wi-Fi, just a metal table and a gray plastic chair. She didn't know the video had gone viral, didn't know that her former co-workers were openly commenting about her, didn't know that the name Cheryl Madden was becoming a living example of abused authority in the service industry. All she knew was that she was being held for investigation, and that everyone around her, including Frank, had stopped speaking to her since the moment she was escorted in. Her face had shifted from calm to concerned, from concerned to frightened. When a security officer quietly said, "They're judging this by the speed of the internet, not paperwork," she understood that the era where a frown could control everything was over. As for Frank Davis, he was in another room, not isolated, but under supervision. He was handed a copy of 14 internal complaints involving Cheryl that he had once closed or redirected. Each line on the document bore his signature. Each verbal warning he once thought of as tactful now served as evidence. He used to think Sierra couldn't possibly track this level of detail. He was wrong. Not only had she tracked it, but she had waited for the perfect moment to release it all, like a verdict with no jury needed. In Sierra's command room, all critical data was displayed on 3 large screens. One showed live social media activity related to Orion Air. Another streamed the camera feed from C-17. The third was a data map, employee behavior, customer feedback, internal reports, being filtered by AI through keywords like rude, boarding denial, and appearance-based profiling. Sierra wasn't seated. She paced the room constantly, listening to briefings from aides while signing off on temporary directives. Each decision was swift and resolute. She had stepped beyond the role of victim. Now she was the one charting the course, redrawing the lines for Orion Air as a whole. On the Twitter monitor, a new tweet stood out. Orion CEO herself just got profiled and denied boarding. If this can happen to her, imagine the rest of us. That line was retweeted over 50,000 times in 2 hours. Alongside it came memes, passenger-recorded clips, and a wave of hashtags like #equal skies, #no more gates, and #red sweatshirt revolt. What began as a personal incident had unintentionally, or perhaps strategically, become a movement. And the spread was so rapid that Orion's PR team couldn't contain it through traditional crisis protocols. In Seattle, Orion's chairman of the board received an email from a major financial partner. "This is an opportunity for decisive action. We're prepared to support Ms. Monroe if she moves to restructure the entire ground operations division." That message signaled that the situation was no longer an internal issue. It had become a strategic branding crisis. Back at Gate C-17, a silver-haired man in a pilot's uniform, Captain Reagan, had arrived after learning that Flight 1735 was grounded. When told the reason, he sighed. A young staffer gave him a quick overview of the incident, Sierra Monroe, and the now infamous twist everyone was talking about. Captain Reagan didn't respond with words. He simply nodded. Then he made his way to Sierra's command room. "Ma'am, I'm here if you need clarity from the crew. We're as shocked as anyone." Sierra looked at him. No nod, no handshake, just a reply. "From this point on, it's not about who's shocked. It's about who's ready." As Sierra Monroe sat in front of 3 data monitoring screens, she no longer saw Cheryl Madden as an individual. She was now just a starting point, an exposed thread. But behind the act of tearing a passport wasn't someone who had lost control. It was the result of a culture that had been allowed to exist, sustained by silence, and reinforced by what internal reports euphemistically referred to as stable operational performance. The problem was that this so-called stability came at too high a cost. Trust eroded, dignity buried, passengers denied service simply for not fitting the profile that ground staff found comfortable. The preliminary report from the data audit team was complete. On the main display, 4 color-coded categories appeared: green for cases handled properly, yellow for violations resolved internally, orange for violations ignored, and red for intentional misconduct that was never reported. Gate C-17 lit up as a blazing red zone on the operations map. At least 37 incidents in the past 18 months were directly tied to biased behavior, ranging from moving passengers of color to seats near restrooms, to delaying boarding under the excuse of further verification, without any corresponding inspection reports filed. More seriously, there were at least 12 cases in which staff denied boarding without scanning passenger IDs through the standard verification system. All had one thing in common: the passengers were of Middle Eastern, African, or South Asian descent. Sierra wasn't surprised. She had heard whispers of such incidents in anonymous emails. in fragmented messages from former staff, in a handwritten letter sealed in an envelope with no return address. But this time, she had data. She had timestamps. She had images. She had witness statements. Orion's internal security team had begun taking statements from employees who worked the same shift as Cheryl. Most echoed the same sentiment in different ways. I knew she was strict, but I didn't think it would go this far. Some added, we tried to raise concerns, but nothing ever happened. Management just shrugged. Frank Davis, the regional manager, after hours of internal questioning, finally agreed to sign a provisional acknowledgement of past complaint handling decisions. The document listed 14 formal complaints involving Cheryl, but only 3 had been properly investigated. The rest had been marked as passenger misunderstanding, unclear personal emotions, or worse, passenger had a prior history of disruptive behavior. Every one of those notes had been written by Frank himself. When asked why, he gave a single answer: because I didn't want to lose her. That sentence cut straight to the heart of the issue. No one wanted to lose staff. No one wanted delays. No one wanted to report violations. And so the system endured, not overtly malicious, but fueled by continuous compromise. In another conference room, the data tech team was analyzing 3 years' worth of internal email threads from the Dallas hub. The results: over 50 email chains between Frank and other shift supervisors discussed sensitive guests, a coded term referring to those they found troublesome, unpredictable, or raising red flags. Many phrases were flagged: middle seat him, less complaint risk, extra ID check won't hurt, better not escalate. These people film everything. These weren't direct orders. They were implicit agreements, vague enough to dodge accountability, specific enough to become action. And more troubling, they repeated across different generations of managers. Not just Frank, not just Cheryl. Sierra ordered the legal team to compile all recurring behavior patterns that could indicate the emergence of an internal discrimination mechanism. The resulting document, more than 80 pages thick, included analyses that revealed even Orion Air's boarding assignment algorithm, originally designed to optimize workflow, had inadvertently mirrored internal bias. Passengers with non-English last names were significantly more likely to be assigned to the final boarding groups. When software engineers rechecked the system, they discovered that the algorithm's frequent flyer prioritization never fully updated passenger histories from underrepresented communities due to data entry gaps from ground staff, mostly from gates like C-17. In other words, even the machines had been trained by human prejudice. And that was the moment Sierra realized. She wasn't just facing an HR crisis. She was confronting a systemic virus, a deep contamination that had spread from protocol to personnel, to tools, software, and even the culture of the workplace. She immediately ordered the official activation of Operation Equal Air. An internal executive directive was issued that same night. Effective 0001, Central Time the following day, all Orion Air ground staff at the 6 major hubs will undergo requalification under new protocols. All customer feedback will be analyzed by AI to identify recurring behavioral patterns in staff conduct. Each shift will include an independent observer, outside the current management chain, tasked with recording inappropriate conduct. At the bottom of the announcement, she signed her name clearly: Sierra Monroe, CEO. The memo wasn't released to the press. It existed only in the internal system. But somehow, like everything in this era, it leaked. An anonymous employee took a screenshot and posted it to X, captioned, "This doesn't stop with Cheryl." And the world now knew it truly didn't stop with Cheryl. When the first reports from Operation Equal Air began to return results, what Sierra Monroe felt wasn't rage, it was something deeper. A cold disappointment that confirmed what she had long suspected. Was never just intuition. It was reality. And it wasn't confined to one person, not just one gate, not just one city. What Cheryl Madden did that day at Gate C-17, the way she tore the passport with smugness, the contempt in her eyes, the posture of someone upholding airline standards, was not an isolated act. It was the outcome of a hidden ecosystem, one not built in boardroom meetings but in hallway conversations, in group chats among shift supervisors, in silent nods as a passenger was harassed and no one intervened. 3 days after the incident in Dallas, The Internal Investigations Office at Orion Air's Atlanta branch received a handwritten letter from a former check-in agent who had left the company nearly 2 years prior. In the letter, the person wrote, "I saw it happening a long time ago. No one dared to speak up, because speaking up meant getting reassigned to the graveyard shift, being labeled not a good cultural fit. Cheryl wasn't the only one. She was just the one who couldn't camouflage. I was once instructed to place all passengers with foreign-sounding last names in the final boarding group. They called it passenger flow management, but really it was just to keep them away from the VIP lounge. I was 22. I needed the job. I stayed quiet." That letter didn't stand alone. Another email came in from the Denver hub. Subject line, "I was told to be discreet." A check-in agent recalled being asked by a manager to reassign seats for 3 black passengers because sitting together might make other passengers uncomfortable. They didn't log the decision in the electronic system. They used admin override access to change the seats without leaving a trace. Sierra ordered the IT team to trace all internal override commands across the system from the past 24 months. The result? Over 7,000 undocumented overrides. 62% of them involved flights where passengers were flagged for inappropriate attire for their ticket class. Data doesn't lie if you have the courage to face it. Sierra had always believed technology would help Orion rise above, but she hadn't anticipated that the very technology, when guided by outdated thinking, would become a tool to conceal bias. Customer scoring systems, boarding behavior analytics, algorithms for classifying consumer habits, all had been unknowingly trained on skewed data. Passengers who had complained about staff were flagged in the system. Those complaints, often made by minorities, would trigger suggestions for extra ID checks. A feedback loop was formed, reinforcing the very biases the system was supposed to eliminate. In New York, a customer service agent submitted an internal report describing how a manager once said, "If a customer looks confused and has a heavy accent, just pretend you can't hear them. They'll walk away." Meanwhile, in Chicago, a security staff member revealed that the head of airport security once instructed the team to stand closer to passengers wearing overly traditional clothing. These stories, seemingly anecdotal in isolation, formed a chillingly consistent picture when lined up together. Sierra didn't release all these findings at once. She knew information was power, but too much power released too quickly could collapse the system in chaos. And she didn't want to destroy Orion. She wanted to reform it from the root. Instead of going public, she convened a closed-door meeting with all regional executives and department heads from 12 major airports. There was no presentation, no PowerPoint. She simply asked one question: "How many of you have ever heard a discriminatory comment during a shift?" and said nothing. The question hung in the room for over 10 seconds. No one responded. Finally, a Latino man, the regional manager of Phoenix Hub, spoke quietly. "I've heard it many times, but if I spoke up, they'd say I was too sensitive." I stayed quiet to keep my position. A middle-aged woman from Seattle added, "I once emailed a complaint about a shift lead who showed bias toward white passengers. After that, I was assigned to 4 a.m. shifts for 8 weeks straight." One story followed another, then another, like bricks collapsing, and everyone in the room realized silence was no longer innocent. It was complicit. Following that meeting, Sierra issued a new internal directive, bypassing the communications department. Effective immediately, Orion will no longer tolerate any form of strategic silence in the face of discrimination. Any individual who witnesses a violation and fails to report it will be considered complicit. Meanwhile, anyone who submits a valid report will have their identity strictly protected and may request a shift transfer within 24 hours of filing. All discrimination-related complaints will be handled directly by an independent task force reporting to my office. Within 72 hours of that directive, the system received 413 new reports from airports across the United States. Some of the cases were minor, but most shared one thing in common: discriminatory behavior never happened publicly. It always hid under labels like reasonable suspicion, supplemental procedure, or discretionary authority, and the person affected was always someone who didn't look like the majority. Sierra read every report. Each one was a voice that had once been suppressed, and now she listened, not as a CEO, but as someone who had been rejected by her own system and lived to tell the story. When a system operates smoothly without anyone having to give orders, that's when it's most dangerous, because it means the wrongs have become routine. No instructions needed, no justifications required. They seep into every action, every glance, every button pressed, and the silence of good people has unintentionally turned wrongdoing into the standard. Sierra Monroe understood this better than anyone. She had once been silent. At 24, newly hired at Orion as an airport operations associate, she witnessed a Sikh passenger being held for additional screening for 32 minutes, simply because his turban made a manager feel uneasy. She didn't say anything that day. She remembered thinking, if I speak up, I'll never get promoted. 6 months later, she was promoted. Now standing before hundreds of testimonies, emails, recordings, and messages, all describing the same culture of selectively deciding who deserves dignity, Sierra realized one thing. It was people like her, who had once chosen silence, who were the most crucial links in the system. She organized a private listening session with 27 employees from various ranks: security, check-in, tech, and janitorial staff. No media, no supervisors. Just a small room with coffee, folding chairs, and a whiteboard in the center. She didn't speak. She just sat and listened. A woman named Carla, a janitor at Charlotte Airport, said, I once saw a flight attendant call a black passenger clumsy just because she dropped her water bottle. I wanted to say something, but I was just the person who mops the floors. Who would listen to me? A technician named Ahmed recounted being reassigned to night shifts for 3 months after protesting that Muslim passengers were being subjected to excessive bag checks. An IT employee admitted he had once been told to hide a system alert that impacted boarding group order because VIP guests shouldn't notice glitches. The room fell silent as Sierra wrote one sentence on the whiteboard. Silence is no longer safe. An older man with Orion since its regional carrier days stood up. His name was Earl, formerly the head of flight attendant training in Atlanta. He spoke slowly. I used to think I'd done well. I taught trainees to be polite, to be professional, but I never taught them how to speak up when their colleagues were wrong. I never asked if maybe our politeness was only for people who look like us. No one said anything for 30 seconds, but every eye in the room turned to him. And for the first time, Sierra saw the one thing every system needs to begin healing: acknowledgement. No excuses, no finger pointing, just someone looking at the past and saying, I was wrong for saying nothing. After that session, Sierra issued a directive to create a network of Room 23s, informal conversation spaces named after the gate where the incident occurred. Each room had a neutral facilitator, not HR, not management, just people who had once witnessed and once stayed silent. The goal was to give people a place to say what they saw, what they didn't say, and why. At first, participation was low. Some called it corporate theater. But then an internal clip was circulated, an Asian American employee describing the moment her manager told her not to speak her native language in the break room because it made others uncomfortable. The employee cried midway through the story, not because of what was said, but because of how long she stayed silent. The clip was shared thousands of times across company emails. And suddenly, the Room 23s were fully booked. A female pilot named Leah shared how she had once seen a Latino passenger denied boarding because he looked nervous. She knew the reason was unjust, but she was a pilot, not ground staff, so she said nothing. Now in the Room 23 at Dallas, she shared the story in detail and said plainly, I'm sorry I didn't do anything. That statement was recorded and later included in Orion's new training materials. Sierra listened to every Room 23 recording. One line stuck with her more than any other. When good people do nothing, bad people don't have to try. She began reaching out to veteran staff, those with quiet influence. Not executives, not managers, but the culture keepers. The ones new hires observed to learn what's truly accepted around here. She called them silent architects, the unspoken designers of company culture. They didn't build software, they didn't write policies, but they determined what passed and what didn't. One of them, Marcus, 19 years as head of airport security in Miami, told her bluntly, I used to tell my staff to be flexible, but in truth I was teaching them to be biased. I chose the easy route, trusting my gut over verification. She asked him, "If I gave you a chance to make that right, would you take it?" He nodded. And so the Silent Architects Reversal Program was born. Those who had once upheld the old culture were now invited to train the new generation, but under one condition: they had to share one time they had stayed silent and what happened because of it. No sugarcoating, no justifying. Marcus's story about the time he let a security officer pull a black woman's suitcase for no reason at a checkpoint became a case study on implicit bias. Carla's story about being just the janitor became a lesson in the soft power of bearing witness. And Earl, the training veteran, became the face of an apology without a period. Sierra didn't expect change to come quickly, but she believed in the power of what had never been spoken aloud. And for the first time in her career, she didn't feel alone when she heard an employee say, "Before, I didn't know who I could speak to. Now I do." Not all good people do wrong, but when good people choose silence, the wrong doesn't need support. It wins by default. Orion called it a full operational behavior review. The media called it a silent purge. But inside the company, employees had a different name for it: the reckoning. Within 48 hours of the Room 23 initiative exploding across the internal network, CEO Alana Reyes, appearing for the first time since the Gate C-17 incident, issued a brief but earth-shaking announcement. "I am calling for an independent audit, not just of data, but of people, memories, and silence." The final sentence of the memo froze the entire company. All invisible data must be brought into the light. Under Alana's directive and the leadership of Sierra's internal team, a special investigative group was formed. But there were no red executive ID badges, no professional camera crews, no nameplates. They were simply known as the collectors. They didn't check pay stubs. They didn't ask about KPIs. They asked one question: "Is there something you witnessed but never dared to speak about?" And they listened, gathering more than any financial audit ever could. In Dallas, a tech staffer recalled being told to ease up identity checks for a certain group of passengers because they're major shareholders. In Charlotte, an HR manager revealed a soft list, a compilation of individuals not aligned with Orion's image, that was never formally recorded. In Miami, a senior flight attendant confessed there was a code on boarding passes marking certain passengers as delay risks based solely on facial features. None of this data ever made it into the CRM system. It was handwritten, passed via internal email, or existed only in verbal memos exchanged between departments. But now, with the collectors knocking, nothing could stay hidden. Alana ordered the creation of a special internal portal named Echo, a place where any employee could anonymously submit files, recordings, emails, or journal entries about any past incident they believed was unethical. Over 37,000 items were submitted in just 6 days. Among them was an 11-minute audio recording of a meeting between two regional supervisors, in which one said plainly, "If someone causes trouble, just push their shift back 3 hours a day. No one can survive on that pay." Another was an email from a senior manager to HR: "Avoid hiring candidates with hard-to-pronounce names. Customers often complain." But the most chilling part wasn't the evidence. It was the consistency. Repetitive. Cold. In none of the email threads did anyone ever ask, "Is this right?" They simply executed, or forwarded, or said, "Thanks for the reminder." Sierra called it a system that runs itself without anyone steering. She proposed an unprecedented kind of audit, not just of paperwork or emails, but of the default ethical processes. Things like, why are VIP customers always routed to the nearest gate? Why are South Asian accented boarding codes often flagged for fast screening? Why in over 12 years has no Native American flight attendant ever reached senior rank? At first, the executive board resisted fiercely. One member bluntly said, "We can't audit an entire operational philosophy." But Alana responded with a single line: "If that philosophy leads to discrimination, we don't just audit it, we replace it." Within 10 days, a 547-page report was completed, bearing the icy title, "We All Saw It." There was no flowery introduction. The first page bore only one bold sentence: It wasn't a system bug, it was a culture feature. The list of violations didn't stop at Gate C-17. It extended into VIP lounges, maintenance ops, the media department, and especially HR. According to the report, HR had turned silence into currency. Ilana didn't release the report publicly, but she mandated that every mid and senior level manager read it, sign a confirmation of understanding, and handwrite a personal response detailing what they would change. She called it the echo response. Each handwritten note was returned. Some were deeply reflective, others were curt and reluctant, but one stood out, causing the entire investigative team to pause. It came from the head of training at the Los Angeles hub, who had stayed silent for 15 years. In his letter, he wrote, "I used to think staying silent was how you kept your job. Now I know every time I stayed silent, I gave away a piece of my decency. I would like to return that silence." That line was printed and posted at Orion's headquarters. No name attached. Only a small caption. From the audit. At airports, digital display boards began to change. Instead of only flight info, weather, or ads, they now rotated excerpts from audit confessions. A traveler walking past Gate 12 saw the line, "I thought someone else would speak up." No one did. I was that someone. Under Alana's guidance, a special team was assigned to redesign onboarding for all new hires. No more slides about speed, service, or polish, but instead a series of short videos featuring real echo testimonies. Every new recruit was required to watch one titled "When They Stayed Silent," in which 3 employees recounted moments they witnessed injustice but did nothing. The video ended with a single question on screen: "What will you do if it happens again?" And for the first time in Orion's training checklist, a new line was added. Did the trainer discuss silence? The audit officially closed on day 31. But for thousands of Orion employees, it was only the beginning. Alana stepped out of the final executive meeting. No press conference, no reporters, just an internal memo sent at 5:37 p.m. The audit is complete, but we are not. Echo will remain open, and so will the future. They didn't call it restructuring. They called it unbuilding to rebuild. Right after the internal audit report reached the top floor of Orion headquarters, Alana Reyes convened an emergency meeting on the 24th floor, the same room once used for strategic war room discussions. No assistants, no facilitators. She opened with a single line: "We are not fixing the system. We are taking it apart." The meeting began with a gesture so simple it stunned the room. She picked up the nameplate on the table, Alana Reyes, CEO, and flipped it face down. Then she presented a list of 17 senior management roles to be placed under moral reassessment. On that list, the chief operating officer, the head of customer strategy, and, most shockingly, the director of culture and belonging, the very person behind the much criticized Harmony training manual that had been accused of classifying people by behavioral profiles. The interviews weren't held in executive suites. They took place in the tech staff lounge, where those being audited sat beside frontline employees, hearing feedback from people they'd never spoken to before. Some resigned, some resisted, but most stayed silent. And silence now was no longer a weapon. It was a verdict. Within 3 weeks, nearly 40% of Orion's senior leadership was replaced. But instead of appointing polished candidates from consulting firms, Alana ordered each vacancy be temporarily filled by a voice-back leader, an employee who had either spoken up during the audit or had once been harmed by the system. In New Orleans, a flight attendant once demoted for improper communication standards, after objecting to a passenger being forcibly moved, was appointed regional training supervisor. In Denver, a warehouse worker who had submitted 13 written accounts detailing time-off abuse was made interim internal operations advisor. They had no MBAs. They didn't know how to create sleek presentations, but they knew something Orion had forgotten: what it feels like to be overlooked. Sierra was tasked with redesigning Orion's entire organizational chart, but instead of the familiar hierarchy of stacked squares, she proposed a circular model where departments were connected not by rank, but by influence ripple. The customer service department was no longer a feedback handler. It became the Experience Transformation Center, operating on par with the executive board. The internal communications division was renamed the Mirror Room, responsible for reflecting the internal truth, even the uncomfortable parts. A small group was spun off and named the Memory Task Force. Their mission: to search for and restore names that had been erased from Orion's records, people who had once worked, contributed, but were no longer remembered. Among them, a man named Javier Cruz, once the first Latinx head of maintenance at the San Antonio branch, whose name appeared nowhere in official files. At the same time, Ilana approved a program called Backward Onboarding. Every senior executive would spend 2 weeks working from scratch, under the supervision of frontline staff. They would clean cabins, load luggage, answer call center lines, assist delayed passengers, all under fake names. One internal video went viral. It showed the former chief legal officer, now known only as Ben R., being yelled at by a customer for failing to provide a wheelchair on time. He didn't argue. He simply lowered his head and tried to fix it. The video ended with a caption: "You may be smart, but have you ever been humiliated for a system flaw?" In parallel, Alana ordered that all performance reports for the next 6 months eliminate financial KPIs, replacing them with 2 new metrics: time to speak, how long it takes for an issue to be reported, and echo rate, the percentage of employees who believe they'll be heard if they speak up. A series of dashboard displays were updated across Orion's branch offices. Gone were sales graphs, instead replaced with blunt numbers like number of leave requests unanswered within 72 hours, 312. Customer feedback left in unresolved queue for over 5 days, 1,187. Percentage of 100% frontline workers consulted before process changes, 9.6%. And at the entrance to Orion headquarters, a large board displayed a single line: "Do you feel seen?" Beneath it, a QR code, leading to an open feedback form with no IP tracking. Under the guidance of the Memory Task Force, Alana launched a new space at headquarters, the Wall of Names, a digital memorial where anyone could submit the name of someone who once worked at Orion and deserved remembrance. Within 2 weeks, over 11,000 names were added. Some of the deceased, some fired, some who had simply walked away in silence. One name appeared again and again: RIP, no last name, but we remember. The one who had stepped up to gate C-17 and never said a word. In the largest internal gathering since the gate C-17 event, Alana stepped onto the stage. No slides, no microphone. She simply read aloud an old email from 8 years ago, back when she was regional director in Houston. In it, an employee had written, "We don't need gifts. We don't need motivation. We just need someone to stand with us before things fall apart." Alana folded the paper. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't do that sooner, but I'm here now." Then she quietly stepped off the stage. No applause. Because in Orion's new structure, the leader doesn't have to stand above. They just need to show up at the right time. Boston Logan Airport, gate C-17, 6 months after the incident. A black woman in her early 40s, wearing an elegant yet modest red velvet dress, walked toward the boarding gate. She wasn't alone. Beside her was a young girl, about 10 years old, with neatly braided hair and an old, worn-out book clutched in her arms. No one turned to look at them. No staff member stopped them. No one said, "Excuse me, are you sure this ticket is real?" Everyone had forgotten her, and that was exactly what she had hoped for. But this time, her ticket wasn't just for first class, it was for seat 1A, center, forward, personally reserved by the CEO. As a vow, no one should ever lose their seat just because they don't look the part. The lead flight attendant bowed slightly in greeting, unaware that just months earlier, in this very cabin, someone had been quietly asked to vacate their seat, for a reason that never made it into any official report. She placed her bag up, carefully pulled out a thin ivory white envelope, and handed it to the cabin supervisor. "What is this, ma'am?" the attendant asked. She smiled softly and replied, "A letter that was never sent." On the corner of the envelope, only one line was written: "To whoever thought I didn't belong." Inside the cabin, no one recognized her. But outside, in the waiting area, a young man was live streaming to hundreds of thousands on TikTok. His camera caught the moment she stepped aboard. The caption read, "The woman in red, she came back." Within hours, the clip went viral with a new caption: She didn't raise her voice. She just raised the standard. The story didn't end there. On Orion flights the following month, passengers began to find a folded leaflet tucked inside their seat pocket, titled The C-17 Reflection. It contained no photos, no glossy PR logos, just white text on a black background. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly and stayed silent? Have you ever believed your voice wasn't strong enough to stop something wrong? The Gate C-17 story wasn't just about a seat. It was about the reflex to stay silent and the moment that broke it. On the final page, there was only one question. If it were you, would you want someone to speak up? And beneath that, a blank space, not for a name, but for a pledge. A pledge that silence would no longer be an option. Soon after, Alana Reyes appeared on a 53-minute podcast titled Invisible Moments. There was no host, just her voice. Calm, not theatrical, not angry. She recounted the first time she watched the security footage from Gate C-17, and what choked her wasn't the staff's action, but the expressions of those seated nearby. No one looked up. No one acknowledged her. They pretended not to see. She said, "I realized all that time I had been one of the people who didn't look up." The podcast ended with a single question. Do I look first class now? No one answered, because the answer wasn't in the image. It was in the action. Orion continued its reforms, but without press releases. A new scholarship was quietly launched, the Seat 2A initiative, designed for students who had once been underestimated, dismissed as unfit for the standard of success. The first recipient was the young girl who sat next to the woman in the red dress that day, her daughter. The letter she had handed to the flight attendant was published publicly a week later, unedited. It read, "I don't need an apology. I need a truth to be acknowledged. That not all wounds need screaming to be seen, and that silence does not mean weakness." On the day Orion completed its restructure, something unexpected happened. A group of former flight attendants, those who had resigned after witnessing the Gate C-17 event without ever being asked for their account, received invitations to return under a new title, Bridge Facilitator, a role designed to connect the system back to the people, not to supervise, but to remember what had been forgotten. On newer flights, passengers sometimes heard a different kind of welcome message. "We don't just fly where you want to go. We fly through what was left unsaid." The woman in the red dress did not attend any award ceremonies. She gave no speeches. She accepted no interviews. But one day in a small elementary classroom in Brooklyn, that 10-year-old girl, now 11, stood up to answer her teacher's question. "Tell us someone who inspires you." She said, "My mom," because she sat down, so a whole system had to stand up. You know, sometimes justice doesn't come with shouting. It comes with a silence that can no longer be ignored. She wasn't angry. She didn't beg to get her seat back. She simply sat down and made the entire system stand up. If today's story made you feel a little warmer, a little more outraged, or even just more aware that someone out there deserves better, let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly while everyone stayed silent? Have you ever stayed silent yourself? Share your experience, because this story isn't just about a woman in a red dress. It could be about any one of us. And if you believe that dignity doesn't need a first-class ticket, hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Boss Stories so you never miss a story where justice doesn't yell, but always wins. Tap subscribe, because the quiet ones deserve to be heard.